Once, not long ago, I went to see the Northman in theaters. I shall now discuss my likes and dislikes of the film.
Firstly, the film had many scenes and elements that reminded me of the original Conan film with Arnold Schwarzenegger, which was apparently an intentional homage to that film. First dislike of the film was kind of in the early parts of the film, where they had a weapon like this being held by warriors that were in the background of one scene. It's likely included in the film because there are a couple weapons mentioned in Icelandic sagas that get translated as halberd, although nothing like a halberd has been found from the Viking Age archaeologically, so I don't particularly like the inclusion in the film. Hollywood is fond of open flames in wood buildings with thatched roof huts. However, history was definitely not fond of these sorts of things. People weren't idiots. I couldn't find a picture of the actual fire pit in the movie, so I made this mock-up, but a character walks by an open pit like this with large open flames, and he's wearing a long woolen cloak, and it just seemed a little ridiculous. Most actual fire pits would at least have some separation like this and cooking pots in the way, so you wouldn't be walking so close to them. Some of them would be raised like this in either wooden pits with sand in them or sometimes bricked in. But walking by something with large open flames with a cloak, good way to get yourself set on fire. As badass as Amleth looks in the movie, holding the sacks backwards probably was not done. It's a beautiful shot, so I'll let it slide, but I think most Viking villages were set further up fjords and harder to reach places. Throughout the film, I think the horses used were way too big for what would have been used in Viking period from what I understand. But there are some beautiful scenes with them in it of the landscape and such, and it helps kind of mask it a bit. So I'm not too bitchy because it may be hard for Hollywood to actually find horses that are the right size to use in films. I'm not sure. I've never tried to rent horses for a film. Regardless, the cinematography is beautiful. They just run up and climb the walls of the fort. Looks impressive on film, but it's a good way to get a rock dropped on your head in real life. I was going to gripe about the lamellar armor here, but I went back and checked my dates, so while a little odd for location, it's time-wise plausible. And now for some good things, like these arm rings. Very, very nice looking arm rings there, and the torque style one, really dug those. Well, I do think the Stav Church is a little early for the time period the movie is set in. I can't deny that they got the architecture of actual Stav churches pretty good, like these you see in these photographs, and also the ones that I myself saw in Norway in these photographs. The impressive emulation of Viking Age architecture continues with this village they constructed for the film, which resembles this village, although this village has thatched roofs. Thatched roofs were used in some locations and wooden in others. It kind of depended on materials available. Also, for comparison, I will show you a few reconstructed Viking longhouses. These next few pics my mother took at the Norwegian Museum of Cultural History. I think they were on our first trip in 1989. I included the next couple pics of modern Norwegian fishing villages to show that despite the change in architecture, the basic setup of villages hasn't changed much since Viking times. The director of The Northman does a wonderful job of showing the landscape of Iceland in some of the wide shots. The desolation, the colors. It's very similar to the fjords of Norway, but kind of its own thing. And I think that it was really nice that he did like these very wide shots showing the colors of the land. Alexander Skarsgård does an amazing job of portraying an Ulfhednar amongst a band of Ulfhednar and Berserk. And they just nail what I think the primal energy and rage of these people would have been. And they did have them go bare of shirt, lacking shirt and armor, showing their fierceness. But they all had such a great energy about them and such a great look about them, even with the baggy pants like the Rus the Eastern Vikings would have had. Alexander Skarsgård himself got very ripped for this film. You can just see in every scene the just passion in his eyes, kind of like this guy here, who's one of the greatest Vikings of all time, I hear. I greatly appreciate that they got the look of the Viking ships right, especially the smaller mastheads. Some movies and shows use huge mastheads, and in real life the ones that have survived are actually fairly small. Just a point of interest here that instead of using oarlocks like we see here or here, the Viking ship in the movie uses oar holes like we see on the Asa-Punk ship. Both were accurate, but interesting choice. Also accurate to period is the placement of shields on the ship's outer hull, which was absolutely done, and it was a nice touch to see it in the movie. Next, I'd like to point out some of the costuming, especially the brooch and tunic that young Amleth wears, that I think in particular show some detail work that most films get wrong or neglect altogether. The belt, tunic, and cloak pin that Amleth's father wears are very accurate also, although we usually see the cloak pinned over one shoulder. Amleth and his girlfriend, when they are captured, are wearing very accurate Slavic tunics. I mean, just look at this gorgeous, accurate costuming. Apart from the minions wearing masks, which I'm not sure they would have worn masks like that in the Viking era, and the muted color palette, everything is right. The belts, the suspension, the armor, the weapons, just beautiful. You don't get that leather biker image. If we compare it to online photos from reenactment supplies and reenactors, yes, some Vikings would have had more muted colors, but there was a wider range, which is about my only gripe with the costuming. The film impresses me almost as much as this man, who happens to be one of the greatest living Vikings of the modern age. Yes, take a look at this incredible specimen of fury and violence. And okay, well, it's me. I guess you figured that out by now. Moving on, although Amleth's girlfriend is Slavic, she does wind up wearing some rather Nordic-style clothing, which is similar to, but not exact to, these pictures we see of Viking women reenactors. The armor in the Northman was also done very accurate, and although this is a fancy king's helmet, it is still a simple nasal helm with mail aventail. Most people wear mail brynies, although one character is wearing some lamellar over their mail. That is known within the Viking world from Vikings that traveled further into the east, such as places like Constantinople. The arms in the film, like the axe shown here, a bearded axe, is also incredibly accurate to period, and the shield being center gripped, accurate. The hilt of the sword, properly designed, down to the rivets that hold the hilt components together, as are the swords we see on the wall behind the main actress. Also take note of the shield that has a stitched rim on it, very accurate. One unintentional bit of accuracy left in the film was the blooper where Amleth takes out a man on horseback with his axe, but as he swings at the horseman, if you freeze frame it, you can see the axe's head flying into the distance as the prop broke. But weapons do break in real life. I really appreciate how much effort they put into getting shields looking accurate. Center gripped, covered in rawhide, stitched rims, although the rims may be stitched on in an inaccurate manner. They still have the iron boss, which on most shields is blackened due to age. These things just look beautiful. Even though there are no sources for how the Vikings actually fought, I thought the positioning and use of the shield in some of the fights did seem very plausible for what we might have seen during the Viking era. And I thought that even though some of the areas they chose to fight in were kind of questionable, that the overall look of the fights and the way they moved and stuff felt fairly authentic. And let's talk about this little rare Norwegian beauty. It looks to be a sword-length sax, in other words, a single-edged sword. They did exist during the Viking era, primarily from Norway, and yes, clear as day in this other shot, this character is wielding a single-edged Viking sword, aka long sax. I thought that was a really nice detail to include. In the movie, Bjork plays a seeress, otherwise known as a vulva in Viking times, or what we may term a witch these days. She is a powerful sorceress. We don't know what vulva wore in the day, but I wanted to show her costume because it is kind of impressive and very primitive and primal looking. How the Norse of the Viking Age viewed the Valkyries may have changed over time, but for the film, they went with the commonly held notion of the spiritual shield maiden warrioress. Here we see her adorned in a cloak of swan feathers, which is a description of a Valkyrie from the sagas, and upon her helm she is wearing a swan crest. At first glance, it may appear the actress has braces on, but this is not what's actually being portrayed here. What is being portrayed are teeth filings, striations in the teeth that were filled with either a dark blue or possibly black resin or paste of some sort. We don't actually know the reason this was done, and about 80% of the finds of this come from Gotland, Sweden. So it seems to be a fairly localized thing during the Viking Age, but possibly associated with warriors. Now this is a shot of actual teeth found at Gotland that show the striations in the teeth that have been filed in. But it was a nice little touch that I don't think most people will actually understand without it being explained to them. So there you go. We don't actually know what occurred at a pre-battle ritual involving Ulfhednar or Berserk. The filmmakers have chosen to express it as a nighttime affair lit by firelight where the warriors dance themselves into a frenzy, led by the silhouetted man mysteriously wearing a horned helmet. And while the horned helmet was not used during the Viking era, it was never worn, there is a precedent for this in pre-Viking imagery, primarily from the dyes used to stamp images into metal that made up helmets, such as the Sutton Hoo helmet. These images are helmet dyes, well, recreations of them, and if you look at the upper left hand, there is a man wearing a horned helmet very similar to the one in this scene. And in this helmet dye, there are two men wearing horned helmets. So I think it's to conjure up kind of an older image, almost ancient to even the Viking times, a primitive feel. When we look at the man when he turns around, we can see one of his eyes is cast in shadow. This, I think, is intentional by the filmmakers as it represents Odin, as Odin gave up one of his eyes to look into the well of Mimir to gain knowledge. Lastly, we have the most obscure reference, and possibly the most controversial. It's not the severed head that's the problem here. This man is a seer, and can hear whispers from the other world through this head, much the way Odin would hear whispers of knowledge through Mimir's severed head. No, the controversy comes in the fact that this man is clearly a practitioner of Scyther magic. What is Scyther magic? Scyther magic is essentially northern Germanic shamanic magic. And during the Viking Age, it was very, very strongly associated with the feminine. Although there were male practitioners of the art were seen as having been emasculated or lesser men because of this. How do we know he is a practitioner of Scyther magic? Well, mostly because of how he is dressed. He is wearing the overdress and large oval brooches that were seen in women's clothing during the Viking Age. We can see them here in this picture in the middle. You can compare the ones he has, and although I couldn't find a picture of it in making this video, when you watch the film, you'll see he does in fact wear them on both sides, and he is in fact wearing the overdress or apron, whichever you want to see it as,